Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan. Viewers in India as around the world have been riveted by tragic scenes of Syrian refugees making their way across Turkey, southern Europe and into the European heartland, particularly Austria, Hungary, Germany. Scenes of great tragedy, scenes which were brought home by that terrifying image of a dead child on the beaches of Turkey. Joining me to discuss the European response to the movement of refugees from Syria is Jakob von Weizsacker, member of European Parliament from Germany. You are with the SPD, the Social Democratic Party. Thank you very much for joining us on Rajya Sabha TV.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little about the evolution of Germany's position on the refugee crisis.
Yes, originally when we opened the borders inside the EU, there was this idea if refugees came from the outside, they would have to ask for asylum wherever they arrived on European soil first, which for Germany meant a very comfortable situation. Thanks to EU enlargement, Germany no longer has any external EU border. So other than some people arriving at Frankfurt Airport, refugees would of course arrive in other countries. So the original agreement on how to deal with refugees in the EU was one that favored Germany in the sense that Germany wouldn't have to do any of the heavy lifting. Now with the crisis, the economic crisis in southern Europe and war in Syria, the situation changed, and it changed dramatically. Many of the refugees would first arrive in Greece. Greece, the country in the worst economic crisis in the entire EU, would basically not be able to accommodate them. They would move through the Balkans. Many countries not yet a member in the EU arrive in Hungary, Austria, and then move on to Germany regardless of the legal setup. And so it was a political decision that you point to say, Chancellor Merkel said, we are going to accept those refugees despite the fact that according to the rules, perhaps they should have asked for asylum in Greece or in Hungary or Austria on the way.
So just to clarify things for our viewers, the rules, European rules as they exist on paper, is that a refugee should apply for asylum at the country where he or she first enters Europe.
That's precisely.
And would then remain there while their case is processed, right? Would have no right to move on further.
That's exactly the situation. They would have to ask for asylum where they arrive first, and then that would be assessed. Now, in the case of Syria, typically, of course, they would be granted asylum because it's a country in a state of war. Syria has more than 20 million inhabitants, but now some estimates say already 4 million have fled the country, and perhaps as many as 7 or 8 million have been internally displaced. So it's a severe humanitarian crisis. So yes, typically they would be granted asylum, but in the countries where they arrive first. That is the traditional setup, but it collapsed owing not least to the economic crisis in southern Europe.
Right. So as a result of Chancellor Merkel's announcement or decision, what kind of numbers are we looking at? How many refugees have entered Germany since this decision was taken?
So in 2015, which isn't over yet, the estimate is that anywhere between 800,000 and 1 million refugees will come to Germany. Now, in an Indian context, that might not sound an awful lot, but you have to bear in mind that the population of Germany is around 80 million, which makes it a bit over 1%. So it is significant, and it requires a significant effort on the part of the authorities and, of course, the local population to deal with that challenge. And so far, the good news has been that the population in Germany has tried to be welcoming. They have set up stands with water and food at the railway stations where refugees arrive, and of course it's a matter of dealing with that influx of refugees efficiently, so that the upbeat mood remains, because of course there are also challenges.
No, we've seen heartwarming scenes of ordinary German people at railway stations, at city squares, adopting a very welcoming attitude towards these refugees, which was at variance with the attitude of politicians, not in Germany necessarily, but what we've been hearing from politicians in Austria or Hungary, for example. It was quite something, quite heartwarming.
No, I mean, I was very impressed as a politician myself. I didn't quite expect it, and as I said, it's a bit fragile. There are, of course, some right-wing extremists who demonstrate and sometimes even attack refugees. There are some more widespread concerns owing to the cultural differences of the refugees coming from Syria to sort of the mainstream culture in Germany. But of course there is an experience with integrating migrants and the children and grandchildren of migrants. We had a huge guest worker program for people from Turkey working in German industry. So there's an experience, but there's some slight unease, and so it is a challenge to make certain that all these things work well, that for schooling, there are many children, things are well organized, that refugees, once they've been established as refugees, they can quickly be integrated into the labor market, so that the welfare state doesn't have to provide for them indefinitely. So there are all kinds of challenges. It's a matter of language. Teaching very rapidly 800,000 to 1 million refugees the German language is a major challenge. So there are all sorts of very practical issues that we need to deal with inside Germany. But then beyond that, there's the wider question of burden sharing within the EU, because while the system before was a little unfair, it was only countries with an external border having to deal with refugees. Now they're very much concentrated on countries like Germany or Sweden. Sweden has been very generous, and I think we have to move towards a system where both in numbers there's a quota, and the funding for the cost of refugees would also have to move from being essentially national to a much more European solution. And beyond that, I'm sure we're going to have an opportunity to talk about it more. There's the question of how can we stop the terrible war in Syria.
Yeah, we'll come to those questions in a second, but you mentioned the scale of the refugee movement in the German context, 1 million in a population of 80. High number, but not quite unprecedented. Pakistan, for example, at the height of the Afghan crisis, I think played host to 4 or 5 million refugees, roughly the same proportion given its population. India in 1970-71 hosted perhaps 4 or 5 million East Pakistani refugees, again in a context of actually a war that the West supported insofar as the Europeans and the US favored a united Pakistan and did not favor the independence of Bangladesh, but that's a separate issue. My point is that until now, it's been countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America that have borne the burden of the great and tragic refugee movements of the last 20 or 30 years. This is arguably the first time that Europe has had to shoulder this kind of responsibility. And I have to say that other than Germany, which has adopted an enlightened attitude, what we see and hear from other European countries and various European politicians is not very encouraging.
I think we need to be a little bit careful with finger pointing, and there are of course precedents. There was a war in Bosnia, a terrible war within Europe, where Austria and Germany at the time very swiftly decided to accommodate hundreds of thousands of refugees, and that was well organized and it worked relatively well. So it's not without precedence even in Europe, although you're of course right when you look at the countries on a per capita basis most affected by refugees today, there would be countries like Lebanon. There wouldn't be countries inside the EU, but I think one needs to be a little bit careful not to perhaps push that point too hard. But I think you're absolutely right. And there are countries with that sort of challenge. However, I think one needs to also be aware of the differences. Take my own country. The idea of setting up a permanent tent city in Germany to accommodate 1 million of refugees, that would not be an option, partly for climatic reasons. I mean, you wouldn't want to live in a tent through a German winter, but also for social reasons. The idea, I mean, imagine a country like Germany with its history to set up that kind of camp. Yeah. It's unthinkable. So the environment is different in that respect, and it's also different in the respect that among the richer countries of the world, you tend to have, for very good reason, a developed welfare state that grants a not very generous, but still, compared to what you get in the rest of the world, relatively generous financial assistance with housing and so on. And so it is actually more expensive per refugee to accommodate a refugee in, say, a country like Germany than it is in a country like Lebanon. So these are all factors that one needs to bear in mind. So it is a major challenge, and I think ultimately we will require European solutions, because the idea that 1 or 2 or 3 countries can bear the brunt of the burden, that's not an idea that is ultimately realistic.
Let's separate out the burden sharing debate for a second. And so there's a financial aspect, obviously, which is who pays for creating the infrastructure or the wherewithal to absorb refugees. And then there's the burden of space, if you will, for want of a better term. So which country will play medium to long-term host for these refugees? So is the German desire to broad-base burden sharing an issue of sharing the costs, or are you really saying that, look, I'm quite happy to put money down, but Germany cannot play host to 1 million people over the long term? Let's find out a way to distribute these refugees across the EU. Is that the argument? Is that the more compelling aspect of burden sharing?
There's an element of both. I mean, let me give you an example from inside Germany. Just like India, we are organized as a federal state.
Yeah.
And when refugees arrive in Germany, there is a distribution mechanism among states, which according to some complicated measures, mostly based on the size of the state in terms of population, but there are also other factors taken into account. There's a complicated mechanism by which asylum seekers are allocated to different regions, including my own. I think many in Germany feel we should have a similar system in the EU overall, where really asylum seekers in terms of numbers are repartitioned among states. But I don't think we should be too strict on that. I think there may be some flexibility on the numbers if to some extent you say we certainly do joint funding. And then if some countries for certain groups of refugees want a little bit more, it will be easier for them, because at least the fiscal cost of the enterprise will be dramatically reduced. So there's an element of both. There's no clear-cut answer in me being able to say it's just the numbers or it's just the money. I think ultimately a solution will require an element of both.
So what's the legal or technical status of the refugee right now? For example, if somebody has been allocated, say, to Thuringia, are they then expected, can they work there? And if they can work, are they not allowed to move out of the land and look for employment elsewhere?
Yes.
How does that? What are the mechanics?
So the mechanics today, aren't still very good. I mean, first of all, you have to go through the processing of your asylum application, and before that's done, there's very little you can do. Basically, you can't work. And in normal times, when there are few refugees around, this may take a couple of months. Now, of course, the system is very, overburdened. There are not enough bureaucrats processing the allocation, so it can take half a year or 3/4 of a year. And so during that period, basically refugees can do nothing. Now, once you are accepted, either as a asylum seeker, or it is said for other reasons it would not be possible to send you back to your country of origin right now, so there's a kind of intermediary status, then in principle you can start accessing the labor market, but there would still be a clause saying only if there's nobody in Germany and nobody from the entire EU, because we have an internal labor market in the EU who fits the description, fits the requirements of this particular job.
But that's a legal fiction, obviously.
Obviously it is, but it is in practical terms, it is a major burden for the first 15 months after you've been accepted as given some sort of a status.
Right.
You're still subject to that restriction. And so there's perhaps the first half year, 3/4 of a year where you can do nothing. Then there are 15 months where you're severely restricted. So even if you learn the language quickly, even if you have a good skill set, it may take 2 years before you can really do anything meaningful with your time as a refugee.
Right.
And those are the sort of things we need to change. We need to become better at rapidly processing the application, providing more rapid avenues to the labor market, because in the end, many of the refugees are going to be integrated into society via the labor market.
Let's talk a bit about the politics of refugee absorption. We've heard senior officials warn that this level of influx is bound to shift the center of gravity of European politics to the right. Because of xenophobic fears. We've heard senior European politicians, Viktor Orban, for example, of Hungary, talk about the threat this is posing to what he calls Christendom. Of course, he meant Hungary, but there is a wider European argument. How fearful are you as SPD, as a social democrat, to the impact that the arrival of refugees within your political context is going to, the impact this is going to have on the right-left center divide in your national politics?
I think it depends both on the numbers, because 800,000 to 1 million in 1 year, it's one thing. I think we can handle that in one way or another, unless something terrible happens. You never know if there's a terrorist attack and something, sentiments run high, then perhaps we're talking a different story. But by itself, this is still manageable.
Yeah.
Now, if you do that for 2 years, for 3 years, for 5 years, we're talking about a very different magnitude of the problem still. So one can't give a general answer. It's about the numbers.
Yeah.
It is about the way we deal with it, and our systems right now are not as good at integrating refugees as they should be. And I've given you some examples of where we have major weaknesses. And of course, it is a way of how does the state and the population, both at the national level but also at the local level, speak to one another.
Right.
So it is a complex challenge, and you're right. If we get it wrong, there's a huge danger of some sort of a regression into identity politics, not based on an inclusive idea of Germany or Europe, but based on a sort of faith and culture and ethnic idea, which would be dangerous given the number of migrants we already have.
Are there signs already in Germany or elsewhere of, you're active in the in European Parliament. Do you see the beginnings of that debate of right-wing politicians fishing in troubled waters?
Well, yes, of course. I would say perhaps 1/4 of my colleagues in the European Parliament, they were elected on right-wing populist platforms. But at the time it wasn't so much, it was partially about immigration, but it was so much on immigration. This is to an important extent was driven by the economic crisis, which we've had in the years after 2007, a severe economic crisis with mass unemployment in many countries, with a huge problem of government debt. So it was more extreme parties gaining ground both on the right and the left as a result of the economic crisis. Now, if you add the refugee crisis to that, you potentially have a more toxic mix.
Yes.
And so that's something one needs to be aware of, and it's something that I would be concerned about. But I think if it's handled well, it doesn't have to escalate, but it could if handled badly.
I mean, the paradox about the movement of such a large number of people, either as refugees or immigrants, is that if you set aside the cultural and political sort of argument for a second, the arrival of such a large number of young people, essentially, it's a great boost for the German and the European economy. I mean, if you look at the success of the United States, it's partly because it has regularly had an influx of people year after year. Could this be a hidden opportunity for Germany and for Europe?
I think in demographic terms, absolutely yes. And as you know, in Europe overall, and Germany is one of the more extreme examples, basically families have very few children.
Yeah.
And as a result, if you look at the sort of demographic pyramid, it's not a kind of normal mountain, but it's actually very thin for the young generation. So you're right, in purely demographic.
And some European countries are looking at extinction if you were to project current numbers far enough into the future.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, if you have exponential shrinkage at some point, so yes, it is an opportunity. But at the same time, one needs to be a little bit careful. If you look at traditional immigration countries like the US, like Canada, like Australia, you will find that they end up with a skill mix with very many high-skilled people going there and fewer of the low-skilled. And to some extent, if you remember the images of Modi in California, this is very much the picture you got from Indian immigration to the US with a clear high-skilled bias. Amazing what the people there achieved, but nevertheless a different segment of the population than you would be getting from a big refugee influx. So that's something you have to bear in mind when doing that comparison. But in principle, you're absolutely right. There is an opportunity here, but it's a little bit more difficult to make it work than it would be if it was based on not a war in Syria, but an orderly immigration policy, perhaps with a point system. And it's actually one of the things we call for. We want to complement our refugee policy with a more modern immigration policy, perhaps along the lines of traditional immigration countries.
We don't have too much of time, but I think it's in the 2 minutes that we have left. We need to discuss a little bit about solutions. And obviously, the kind of outflow of people from Syria is not tenable for Europe or for Syria. The international community needs to focus its attention on bringing an end to the war. There's been a shift in international discourse over the last 10, 12 days, largely thanks to the intervention of Vladimir Putin and his assertion that there are only two games in town, that either we back Assad or you're backing ISIS. How do you see this binary? Or do you think there are more complex options that the world and Europe has in trying to find a solution for Syria?
I think the situation, first of all, is more complex than that. I mean, of course, there's US involved, there's Russia involved, there's Saudi Arabia involved, there's Turkey involved. The EU also plays a role, but we have a long way away from being able to fix this on our own.
Yeah.
And specifically, when you talk about the question, either it's Assad or ISIS, I think one needs to be aware of the fact that it's not a given that whatever we do, we end up with one Syria. And that's a particular concern that I think one needs to bear in mind. The question is, how can we assure that perhaps the country stays one country? Because we may end up with a not very pretty political situation in one part of Syria with Assad, who's not a terribly benign dictator, and on the other hand, we may still have ISIS. So it is a complicated situation, but it's certainly one that needs addressing. And I greatly welcome the dialogue that you've described and thinking about previously taboo options.
Right.
But I don't think we should rush to the conclusion that, we just need to back Assad and then problem solved. I think that may be simplifying things a bit too much.
Right. Well, on that note, Mr. von Weizsacker, we'll have to end it. Thank you very much for joining us on Rajya Sabha TV.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, that wraps up this episode of IST. Do join us again next week with another guest. Thank you for watching.